Good evening, everybody. Thank you for logging in tonight for CPA Presents. My name is Mike Kasalniak. I'm the CPA Flight Chair. Our tonight's topic is what is Part 150 study? What is the purpose of the study? The Part 150 process and why update the study? Our speaker tonight is Mr. Eugene Reindel. Gene is the Vice President of the Aviation Environmental Services Group at HMMH. And HMMH stands for Harris, Miller, Miller, and Hansen. Gene manages a wide range of aviation noise consulting projects and provides technical support on aviation-related noise studies and noise measurement programs. Gene has focused the greater part of his career on aircraft noise and consulting across the country and internationally. Gene is a trained facilitator and leads public outreach programs associated with controversial noise studies and programs, and uses his training to facilitate community noise forum type meetings. He also teaches courses in acoustics, sound measurements, and noise modeling. Gene enjoys and excels at presenting complex issues of aviation noise in an easily understood manner. Over the last 20 years, Gene has become a leader in the aviation industry. His commitment to excellence in engineering, design, and environmental awareness is proof of his love for all aspects of acoustics and the importance of these aspects within aviation practices. Gene holds a master's in engineering and acoustics from Pennsylvania State University and a BS in physics engineering from Pacific Lutheran University, Washington. If you would like Wings credit for this online seminar, please send me your full name and email in the comment section of the Zoom session, or send me an email at flightsafetykoloradopilot.org. Let us begin. I now turn over this Zoom online presentation to our guest, Mr. Eugene Reindel. Thank you for accepting our invitation, Gene. We really appreciate it.
All right, well, thank you also. Hopefully you can hear me okay. And are you seeing my first slide? Okay, great. So this is about airport noise compatibility planning. It's basically what airports have available to them to address noise concerns in and around the airport. But I'll get further into that as we go. I did not realize that Mike was going to give such a strong introduction, so I put a little bit of an introductory slide here. Basically, I do, as Mike was saying, I consult to airports over aviation noise issues, whether related to land use compatibility or just aircraft noise. Major focus of tonight is the Part 150, which is airport noise compatibility planning, for which I've been involved with well over a dozen of those studies. And in fact, I counted up just 10 in the last 5 years, including the one at Centennial Airport in Colorado. And so the agenda is pretty brief. I'll talk about what are the federal regulations in regards to aircraft noise in the United States, and then dive into the ones in particular, which has to deal with airport noise compatibility planning, or Part 150, and then talk about the current Part 150 update at Centennial Airport. And that I'll just be talking about why they're updating it at this time. And so there are several noise-related legislation, and it is worth noting that aircraft noise is almost solely under the purview of federal regulation as opposed to state or local regulations. A lot of local land use regulation can also include noise limits and noise regulations locally, but those do not apply to aircraft noise. Aircraft noise is governed by federal legislation. And it really started with the dawn of the jet age in the 1960s. Early 1960s was the first aircraft jet that was flown, and a lot of the concern was also about sonic boom. And so there was an Aircraft Noise and Sonic Boom Act of 1968. And what that resulted in with the FAA is the preparation of Part 36 and 91, which those really deal with certification of aircraft in terms of noise. Okay, so what are the limits that they have to meet in order to certify their aircraft? Then shortly thereafter was the National Environmental Policy Act, which directed federal agencies to assess environmental effects of proposed federal actions. And currently, those regulations are resulted in two orders from the FAA, 1050.1F and 5050.4B. And it is our understanding that 5050.4B is going to be incorporated into 1050 when it is redone later this year. And so those are really how the FAA implements NEPA, or the National Environmental Policy Act. Then there was a Noise Control Act of 1972, which amended the 1968 Act to add consideration of public health and welfare, and to add EPA to the rulemaking process for aircraft noise and sonic boom standards. So it was just an amendment to the Aircraft Noise and Sonic Boom Act. But then the first one of real substance that you'll want to be aware of in terms of aircraft noise and how we address it today is the Aviation Safety and Noise Abatement Act of 1979, also known as ASNA, that really directed the FAA to establish a single system to measure noise and determine exposure of people to noise, and then also identify land use as normally compatible with various noise levels from aircraft operations. And so that resulted in what's known today as 14 CFR Part 150, or Airport Noise Compatibility Planning. However, it wasn't until the Airport and Airway Improvement Act of 1982 that there was any funding available for implementing these airport land use compatibility or airport compatibility planning studies. And so it was really not until 1982 that the funding was in place, which is known as the Airport Improvement Program today, and it's still in existence today. It's all these types of studies are funded through the AIP, and also any measures that you recommend, that the airport recommends in the Part 150, some of those also are able to be funded through the AIP program. And then in 1990, another one important to remember came ANCA, which is the Airport Noise and Capacity Act. And what the main purpose of that was to phase out the older Stage 2 aircraft. So I talked about the Aircraft Noise and Sonic Boom Act of 1968, which led to Parts 36 and 91, which dictates how you certify aircraft in terms of airworthiness for noise. And so this Noise and Capacity Act phased out Stage 2 and older aircraft. We are currently at, through Part 36 and 91, we are actually through now Stage 5, which is much quieter than the Stage 2 aircraft. But what also happened, and I think it really was a result of a lot of airports using Part 150 as the means to restrict access to the airport based on noise, that they also, part of the ANCA was to establish requirements regarding airport noise and access restrictions for Stage 2 and beyond aircraft. It specifically says Stage 2 and Stage 3, but we're pretty certain that Stage 4 and beyond are also still apply to the Airport Noise and Capacity Act. Basically, what that did is tied the airport's hands into being able to restrict operations at their airport. Basically, it can't be done given the grant assurances that the airports sign up for other AIP type projects. And then the last two there, Section 506 of the FAA Modernization and Reform Act, that phased out the Stage 2 aircraft less than 75,000 pounds, so the smaller aircraft, whereas ANCA phased out the larger aircraft over 75,000 pounds. It wasn't until 2012 that there was, and it was actually not until 2015 that we fully phased out the Stage 2 and older aircraft from the lighter jet or lighter aircraft being of 75,000 pounds or less. And then of not much consequence here tonight, but the FAA reauthorization of 2018 did have several measures in it that dealt with aircraft noise, but there hasn't been any regulation resulting from those as of yet. So now going more specifically into the airport noise and compatibility planning. So again, the FAA created that in response to the ASNA, or Aviation Safety and Noise Abatement Act of 1979, codified under Title 14 of the Code of Federal Regulations, Part 150. Formal citation is 14 CFR Part 150, but everybody knows in this industry, if you talk in Part 150, that it's the noise compatibility planning. It is a voluntary process. This is important to understand. Airports do not need to undertake these studies. But if they do, it has a very well-defined process for how you assess aircraft noise and how you assess land use compatibility, and then also ways of mitigating and abating those high noise levels. Airports primarily participate in 150 to get access to FAA funding, some approved measures, and because it follows a well-established, understood, accepted, and comprehensive process, meaning that they can rely on the results because they follow the process, and therefore they can stand behind the results of their assessments. There are two primary elements to Part 150. The first is the noise exposure map. And the noise exposure map is really the assessment of what the aircraft noise exposure is to the communities adjacent to the airport, but also what is the land use compatibility with that aircraft noise. And then a noise compatibility program is designed to address the incompatible land uses that exist around an airport. And so the first is kind of your inventory, if you will. What is the land use compatibility around an airport? And then the noise compatibility program are the measures that the airport recommends after analysis and review, what they recommend to address their incompatible land use. It does require consultation with all local, state, and federal entities with control over land use within the 65 DNL area and greater, and also consult with FAA regional offices, regular aeronautic users of the airport, the air traffic control, and then also all parties interested in reviewing or commenting on the document. And when you do a noise compatibility program or an update to the NCP, you must also offer for a final public hearing on the airport recommended measures. So the FAA defined the voluntary process for airport noise studies, and it actually accepts the noise exposure map as being done in accordance with Part 150. And the map that's shown here, I believe, is, yeah, it looks like San Antonio, one that was probably done in the mid-2000s, probably 2015 or so. So it shows the outermost red contour is the 65 DNL, and then it shows land uses. And the yellow there that you see throughout the map is residential, and those are the ones that, if they're inside the red lines, are incompatible. The FAA also accepts the noise compatibility program as being done in accordance with Part 150, but then it either approves or disapproves the measures recommended by the airport. And it does, again, comprehensive public and stakeholder involvement is expected. If you're to ask the FAA, one of the primary reasons an airport should undertake Part 150 outside of the funding mechanism and outside of the process, it's really to reach out to your communities and understand their concerns with the noise they're experiencing from aircraft operations. This here goes into quite a bit more detail about how you develop that noise compatibility program to address those incompatible land uses. But there's basically three primary strategies that you look at. One is noise abatement strategies. Those are the things that you do. Noise abatement, think of those as typically things you do in a cockpit. How you might fly differently, where you fly, how you fly, preferential runway use, arrival and departure procedures, Are there modifications you can make to the airport to maybe reduce noise in the areas? And then it also mentions use restrictions. And while use restrictions are a part of what you evaluate in Part 150, again, because of Part 161, which resulted from the Airport Noise and Capacity Act, you basically can't do use restrictions at an airport at this point. And then under land use strategies, so you first look at noise abatement strategies, try to reduce the number of people exposed to aircraft noise, and reduce the number of incompatible land uses. But for those that you can't address completely with noise abatement strategies, you then turn to land use strategies such as land acquisition. Maybe you want to buy the properties and acquire them and make them compatible with the aircraft noise that they're experiencing, such as more of an industrial type use of the property, like warehouses or things like that. Other is sound insulation of noise sensitive parcels. So like providing doors and windows to residential properties, things like that. There are other things such as aviation easements, prevention, land use controls that maybe prevent the introduction of new incompatible land uses, and then also real estate disclosures. And then for the programmatic strategies, those are basically how are you going to implement and monitor and report on the noise abatement or noise mitigation measures that you have recommended and implemented. And then also it puts in there when and how are you going to update the NEM, and what are the triggers to actually updating your noise compatibility program. Oh, clicked on the wrong one, just a sec here. There we go. So this kind of lists in priority how you go through them. I kind of already talked about that. What's on the left-hand side, step one is to identify the non-compatible land uses. That's the noise exposure map. And then consider those noise abatement strategies to reduce the number of people exposed. Consider land use strategies to mitigate incompatible land uses or to prevent the introduction of new incompatible land uses. And step four, again, how are you going to manage your noise compatibility program? And then what's off to the right is what you need to evaluate in order to determine whether an airport will recommend it. You need to evaluate the effectiveness of each measure. That is, how effective is the measure at reducing incompatible land uses? That's really the measure. Evaluate the feasibility. Operationally, can you do it? Safety-wise, would the FAA allow it to be done? Economically, is it causing unfair disadvantage to any operators at the airport? And then you select your preferred package of measures and identify with those measures, the schedule for implementation, who's responsible, where's the funding going to come from, how much is it going to cost? And then also those measures that you evaluate but don't recommend in the end, you still document those and provide reasons as to why you did not recommend a measure that you evaluated. Okay, so that's it. Really what I had for Part 150 wasn't a lot. It was intended to be an overview, maybe provided you more of a background as to what Part 150 is, maybe even a little bit about what it is not. Now a little bit about Centennial Airport. They are currently updating their Part 150 at this time. And they're actually updating both the NEM, which they last updated back in 2017, which is shown here in that map there where their 65 DNL resides and the land uses around it. But the original Part 150 was completed back in 2008 and that was included the noise compatibility program, and that has not been updated since 2008. And so they're updating the NEM based on current and forecast operations. Typically Part 150 for the noise exposure map, it includes 2 years. One is the year of existing conditions, so the year representing current conditions when you submit the NEM to the FAA for review. And then the FAA is basically wanting to see 5 years out from that. The regulation says at least 5 years out from the existing condition, but it's become standard practice to be exactly 5 years out. part of the reason for that is that's the FAA forecast of funding is out at 5 years at a time. So they can't look much past 5 years for funding. So they've recommended airports stick to an existing condition and a 5-year forecast condition. Centennial is also updating the NCP, as I said, to review alternative solutions to incompatible land uses from aircraft operations, and really developed a more balanced program to address aircraft noise effects on surrounding communities and land uses. So we're just getting started. Nothing is updated at this point. We are working on preparing the forecast there and developing the contours. And once we have the contours, then obviously we assess incompatible land uses and then really start looking at the measures that the airport wants to move forward with as part of their noise compatibility update. And I believe that was my last slide. Yes, so certainly open it up to questions and more discussion. I thought this would take me longer. I thought it was around 30 minutes, but should leave plenty of time here. So open to answer questions as you have them.
Hey, Mike. Gene, this is Mike Kasoniak. Okay. Is it okay to get into the nuts and bolts of the AEDT?
Sure.
Okay. One of the things I read about today was that one of the processes, I'll go through them as I read them today. I went through your ADT site today, as well as the 2008 Part 150 study. Can you explain how you create the flight tracks?
Well, it varies by airport. It depends on the value of the data that they have on their system. Typically, what is done is you take at least 12 months worth, a recent 12 consecutive months of flight track and aircraft identification data from their monitoring system, and which is what we're doing at Centennial. And then we are using those tracks to develop modeled tracks. And so the modeled tracks represent all of the tracks. So what you'll do is have a track that is departing and going somewhere, a specific destination, and you'll bundle all those together. And then, for instance, HMMH has a method that provides the statistical mean of those tracks, and then also automatically puts another 3 to 5 what we call dispersion tracks on that to really encapsulate that. And so that's typically how the aircraft flight tracks are developed. And again, it's from actual data that the airport usually has. If the airport doesn't have it, we can reach out to the FAA and possibly get the data from them. But there are also vendors that maintain and keep that data for some period of time. So we can go back and actually get that data from one of 2 or 3 vendors as well.
Okay. The other thing I saw, it says view airport weather. Do you review all 12 months of weather?
So what we typically use for weather, the FAA, when they developed AEDT, they went with a 20-year weather history for every airport in their system, in the AEDT system, and we use that. But since then, in the last update of AEDT 3A, I think it was, they actually went from a 20-year average to a 10-year average. So we're actually using a 10-year average for weather per FAA regulations at this time.
Okay. And could for our viewers out there, in case you don't know, the AEDT is the Aviation Environmental Design tool that the FAA uses in doing the Part 150 studies. This software was released in 2015. Gene, what I didn't understand, and that's one of the reasons I wrote it down, receptor and receptor sets.
So so a little bit about AEDT modeling. So what AEDT does is basically flies the aircraft from an annual average day. So you take 365 days of aircraft activity at the airport, you divide that by 365 to get an annual average day, and you fly those essentially through this integrated model. And it has all the noise power distance curves and all the profiles like speed and thrust and all that we get from the manufacturers, and it's incorporated into ADT. And so what ADT then does is calculates the noise levels at grid points. And ADT uses a regular grid, or you can define a user-defined grid, or you can put in identified receptor points. So if there are areas or points in your neighborhoods or points of interest that you would like to be modeled and get a specific answer at that point, you can put those in, and we call those usually sensitive receptors.
Okay. Wow. The other thing that I noticed today when I was going through this stuff, and when I first met you at the open house there at the Exploration of Flight, and we were talking about 2 years to do this study, it never really dawned on me why it took 2 years until I read the Part 150 study, and I'm
Right.
like, oh my God. One of the things that really caught my eye, and I think you just said it, is that within your software is already loaded the number of aircraft operations by type, the types of aircraft, day, evening, nighttime distribution by type, flight tracks, flight track utilization by type, flight profiles, typical operational procedures, and the average meteorological conditions.
Right.
And it just blew me away that there's so much information. And when you were just talking about the receptor sites, if you go to the Part 150 study that was done in 2008, towards the end of the study is a big map. And they have identified all the receptor sites, like you said. They just, I don't know how they came up with them or picked them, but somebody did. And it was amazing. Now, in your work on this Part 150 study, I'm sure you review the last the one that was done in 2008. Maybe not, because it's pretty much old data.
No, we do. And in fact, that's one of the things that's currently ongoing right now, because we have the previous 12 months of data from the system. We're comparing what was recommended back in 2008 as to whether it was, one, approved by the FAA, and then whether it was implemented. And if it was implemented, what is the level of compliance with what was expected from that implementation? So all that is being reviewed as we are preparing the current noise exposure map.
Okay. The one thing I did come across today too was the record of approval that was done by the FAA for the Part 150 that was done in 2008. Could you just explain what the difference is between stage 1 jets and stage 2 jets?
Yes, it's pretty simple actually. Stage 2 jets are anything that was noise certified through the airworthiness certification process of the FAA. If it was not a stage 2, it was at the time identified as stage 1, meaning it basically didn't require certification for noise, so it doesn't have a noise certificate. So I think if I remember right, somewhere around 1976 or something like that, you had to comply with stage 2, and anything before that date, they weren't requiring manufacturers to go back and certify anything that had already been manufactured. It's just anything leaving the manufacturing line at that time had to meet stage 2. So, and that's a good question, because it also reminds me to talk a little bit about stage 2, 3, and beyond. That it doesn't mean that stage 1 was louder. It just means it wasn't certificated. And then also stage 3 certification had lower limits of which you could produce noise from an aircraft. But just because it's a stage 3 aircraft doesn't mean it wasn't quieter than, or it was quieter than all the stage 2 aircraft. There might have been stage 2 aircraft that were quieter than some of the stage 3. And so what the stages represent is the date in which it was certified, because it had to meet the noise regulations in place at the time of their certification.
Okay, I thought it had to do with stage 1 was the loudest, stage 2 was a little bit quieter,
They
and if
are
you would,
typically, yes, that's typically the way the progression has gone. But there are a lot of, particularly like stage 4 aircraft that were certificated as stage 4 aircraft that actually also comply with stage 5. In fact, the majority of stage 4 also comply with stage 5. So you can't just say they're quieter. Yes, that was the intent, and that's what we were able to gain over the years of enforcing, you know, and make sure that the airplanes, when they left the production line, were quieter than, you know, what the limits were previously. And so we did get quieter aircraft as a result of ICAO and the FAA having these noise stages.
Okay. Another or two other documents that I came across today while reading the study was I think they were put out by the FAA, and it really blew my mind that there's two documents out there that listed at the time every manufacturer, every type and model of aircraft, and the noise that they generated for some reason. There was a bunch of numbers which I didn't understand, but I just could not believe that they had documented every airplane. I mean, I was looking for Cessnas and Pipers, and finally I found it in the second document. The first document mostly was 737, 747,
Right.
you know, the heavy iron. And then the second document more had GA aircraft. And I didn't realize that there's a max noise limit that these aircraft are certified for. I found that very interesting.
Yeah,
Very
and
interesting.
those two documents are basically found in Part 36 and Part 91 that I mentioned earlier, but there's another good source too that we use. It's from the Environment or European Union. Um, and I forget the name of it now. It's EASU. Anyway, sometimes that's just more up to date, it seems like. And so sometimes we have to go there as well to get some of the noise data.
Mhm. Okay.
But yes, there's a
Well,
list for thousands of aircraft types.
all right. I don't know if we have any real estate people out listening with us or people that know real estate people. Um, but we do have a housing development being built south of Centennial Airport. And I was wondering if in their real estate disclosure documentation, there's anything in there about the Centennial Airport. I haven't found anything to date yet, but if anybody knows of anything out there, please let me know. I appreciate it. Um, do you know if that's a requirement in the state of Colorado?
I don't believe it is. I do. So the one of the things we're going to look at and what was in existence in the 2008 NCP for Centennial was was the existence of or having an airport influence area, I think it was called. And what that wants to try to do is determine, okay, if you're in a certain area, what are the requirements? And real estate disclosures could be one of those requirements. But remember that the NCP is only what the airport is recommending. The airport or the FAA, neither one of them are able to enforce land use policy or implement land use policy. So if the local jurisdictions haven't adopted what the airport recommends, then they don't have to. There's nothing forcing them to do that. And that's one of the things that we're going to try to do in this update is really work with those local jurisdictions and not just put something out there, but say, what would you be willing to live with? Or what is it that you could do? How can we work together on this? Because it really is an issue. And Centennial, there have been several planning developments that they've been asked to review because the jurisdictions do at least comply with that part of their airport influence area, that if it's in that area, they actually give it to the airport so that they can
Right.
comment on it.
Yep.
And they have commented their recommendation is not to move forward with it several
Right.
times, and they've ignored that essentially.
Correct. Yeah, I've been to the board meetings on that, and a lot of people have asked that question. Not recommended, not recommended, not recommended, but they're building right now and they're bulldozing the land right now.
Mhm.
I think you answered this question at one of the meetings I attended, but I'm going to ask it anyway, just so the people that are listening. The 12 noise monitors that are around the airport right now, that data that they've generated over the course of a number of years, will that data be used as part of your 150 study?
Yes and no. I want to be very clear up front that the no part is that the FAA is really adamant that those measurements cannot be used to determine or validate the extent of the 65 DNL contour, right?
Okay.
You can't use them to generate the contours. We will report them. We will show how they compare to what the noise contour results are, and we'll probably document trends in the noise, at certain ones. Has the aircraft noise gone up or down or stayed about the same, those sorts of things, using those monitors. But again, it cannot be used to develop or validate the contours.
Okay. Yeah. I believe you asked me that, but I know the general public at the meetings we've attended were and so was I. I was a little, "Oh, are we going to use it or not? We're going to use it." Okay. Good.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Anybody else got questions? I've been asking away here. I'm going to
Oh,
close.
I've got a
I'm
couple
going to
questions.
mute myself for a little bit.
All right. Well, good questions, Mike.
I'll sneak one in here that came in through the chat. Who's the provider of the noise monitoring equipment? I think it means the manufacturer.
Yeah, I believe the equipment that they have is from Bronkier or B&K, and it's currently being maintained by EnviroSuite.
So I have a question. So the HMMH merely does the study of the noise analysis based on the parameters that are typically within the Part 150 study. Once the study's done and you kind of bundle it up and send it off to the FAA, it's only then that any decisions or changes would potentially come out of that. Is that correct?
For the most part, that is correct. I have been involved in some studies that there was something so obvious that could be done and easily implemented that nobody saw a reason to wait because federal funding wasn't required. And it did show just an incredible reduction in those exposed to noise, that they went ahead and started the process of putting in a new procedure to address that. So they didn't wait, but typically what you say is correct, is that you go through this 2 year or so process. It culminates with the airport making recommendations to the FAA for what they want to do to address their noise compatibility. And then it's after the FAA then goes through a 180-day process to approve or disapprove measure by measure. So they'll put out a record of approval. Mike alluded to that for the 2008 that he pulled up. There is a record of approval that goes down item by item and either approves or disapproves each item. And those that are approved then qualify for federal funding. And so one of the big items for larger airports around the country is sound insulation. So once you have that approval to do a sound insulation program, the airport can then put a grant together and start requesting federal funding to implement their sound insulation program. So that's kind of the process.
So the ultimate result is either grants for like sound insulation, what you were saying, that would directly impact the homeowner's ability to soundproof their house, or are there changes with the way the air traffic works within the pattern of the airport, or changes in that area? Is that part of potentially the outcome?
Yes. And so I was mentioning earlier, there's two types of measures. One is the noise abatement measures, and what you were just talking about, changing a flight procedure or, augmenting or amending the airspace. Any changes to an aircraft procedure, that's considered a noise abatement measure. And those things, as I was saying, usually don't require federal funding because it's just that you go in, there's a process to go through to change a flight procedure. If something like that is recommended out of this, then you just go through that process.
The decision-making process that the FAA goes through to determine either grant funding or adjustments in patterns or how the airport flow works, is that a public-facing decision-making process, or does that happen at the FAA, and then when they're done with it, they announce that to those that are impacted?
It depends.
Okay.
So the the 180-day decision making that they do on whether they're going to approve or disapprove each of the measures recommended that by the airport, they will put the NCP into the Federal Register so that they can get public comment on those outside of what the airport's already gained public comment. But then they go through their 180-day process and come up with a record of approval, which not necessarily a public-facing result, but a lot of airports then do publish that record of approval. And in fact, the record of approval is published by the FAA if you know where to look for it. And so all those measures that did get approved or disapproved is shown in that process. And then why I said it depends also is because if the if one of the recommendations from the airport is to change a flight procedure, the FAA approves that flight procedure. The FAA then starts its process. Well, actually, take a step back. Once it's approved, the airport then has to, or usually the FAA has them make the recommendation to the FAA to go ahead and implement. And then it gets put into their process and they determine what level of NEPA or the National Environmental Policy Act they need to comply with, whether they can simply do a categorical exclusion, which is the simplest route, whether it's an environmental analysis or a full environmental impact statement is required. And so anyway, to implement a procedure, some level of NEPA is required. It's not required of Part 150, but when they go to actually implement that procedure, it may require NEPA analysis, which is a fully public-facing study.
Okay. So, I mean, realistically, you know, let's say you started tomorrow on the you know, an particular airport, and you know, 2 years from now you generate the port report. It may be 6 months to a year before any sort of results come out of that at the end.
Correct. And then if they go through the full process, then it's probably another, year or so to go through the design and implementation of the procedure.
So as much as even 4 years then.
Yeah.
Okay.
It
And then
can be
that's
timely. But that's, like I said, that's one of the things that if we see something that's just obvious, no brainer, easy to do type thing, they don't have to wait on the NCP, but typically you follow this process all the way through, and then so it's a matter of years before there's major changes like that.
other questions from the folks in attendance?
I have a real quick question. I apologize if it was already answered. I had some interruptions on my side towards the beginning of this. I caught that Centennial Airport is in the process of updating their study for this. Do you know if one's been done for Rocky Mountain Metro, or if one is imminent on the horizon?
So my understanding is that Rocky Mountain Metro has not done a 150. They do have a community noise roundtable that meets almost monthly. And they had actually recommended to the airport that they do undertake Part 150. And again, it's a voluntary process. My recollection is that they have not participated in Part 150, but they're considering doing so at this time.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Does the state level government have any sort of impact on the decision-making process, or is this strictly from from when you're contracted and then up through the federal government?
This is a federal process, but it's not saying that the state doesn't have any say in it, but it is pretty limited. And the say that the state might have is on, and Mike alluded to it earlier, like disclosures, real estate disclosures, those sorts of things. Anything that has to do with land use and implementation of land use measures, there might be state criteria or state regulation that either allow or don't allow certain things. There is occasionally, 150, we will recommend that be reviewed, that we will look up what the statutes are, and we may recommend modification to those to allow for more local restrictions on land uses to be more compatible with the airport.
Mike, nobody's lining up at the door to ask questions.
One of the things that I did notice in the last study, and it was approved, and it was brought up at one of the meetings this year, they were going to recommend, where was it here? They were going to implement a 010 departure heading for jet aircraft at night out of Centennial. This measure recommends aircraft operations implement a 010 departure procedure off runways 35 right and 35 left between 10 p.m. and 6 a.m. And it was approved by the FAA as voluntary, subject to weather and operational safety and efficiency. The next one down, they had asked the FAA to do a test flight procedure that would fan northern departures between 350 and 010 degrees headings on a 24-hour basis, weather and traffic permitting, and that was disapproved. So for night operations, the 010 was approved, but for daylight operations and night operations, the 350 to 010 was disapproved. And that was brought up at one of the council meetings this year, and they were going to check into it to see if the ATC was doing it or not. And I haven't heard anything more about it, if they have or if they haven't. Anybody out there know what's going on with that one?
I'm not familiar with that.
Okay.
I will remind you that those are things that we will be reviewing and seeing, we'll look at the nighttime and are they more using 010 or not? We'll have that in the data, and then we can review with the tower as well, how are they directing traffic? So we'll review those measures as part of this project.
I think one of the biggest eye openers for me today was reviewing that Part 150 study, and one of the first maps they showed was the layout of the airport and what was open space and what was not open space. And I'm looking at it, I'm going, that's not open space anymore, boys and girls. That's all residential now. So that was very interesting. And I encourage everyone out there that's watching this to go to the Centennial Airport website, go into their, what they call more, and there's a thing in there called noise, and go to the Part 150 library. And that's where all this information and data over the years is kept. And yeah, just peruse through that study and you look at those maps and all the work that went into this 150 study. And now I really understand why it's takes so long, because you go down to right down to the nitty gritty on this thing and on the data. And I was surprised that the listing of all the aircraft by type, how many landings they made, how many takeoffs they made. And I think I said this earlier, Saberliners were in there. I mean, they don't even fly those things anymore.
Right.
It was very interesting. So I encourage everybody out there to take a look at that. The other thing with this Part 150 study, I'm sure HMMH, I think you guys talked about it at one of the council meetings. You'll be posting some of this stuff online.
Correct. Yeah. Really follow the Part 150 website. I think it's about ready. Anyway, there will be information being published there on a regular basis, and you'll be able to track the progress of the study through the website. And you'll also be able to send emails and things like that and ask questions. And then, if you don't see something in there and we have it available, we could put something out there. So anyway, I highly recommend people pay attention and really follow the progress of Centennial Airport Part 150.
Gene, do you have an office here in Denver?
HMMH does not. We have 2 people located in Denver, but they work out of their homes. We are also a sub on this. We're not the prime contractor, and the prime contractor is Mead and Hunt, and they do have a local Denver office.
Okay, and they have a website where you could look this stuff up as well.
Yes, I believe so.
All right, really cool. It's. I'm glad I took the afternoon to dig through this stuff, because
I'm glad you did too.
I'm a lot more informed about what's going on and how you do this.
Yep.
Yeah, Mike, can I add a comment or two?
Sure, go right ahead.
All right. The departure recommendations to 010, and I think Don Kuski can comment on this too, but at this point, that's voluntary. And it theoretically does take you over an uninhabited area there just southeast of Cherry Creek Reservoir. There are several things that we recommend to pilots if they can comply and do so safely. As for the noise monitors, we have several that are permanently installed. 4 of them are in Douglas County. And we have been monitoring the information gathered with an outfit that's in Australia. And we also have some portable ones that can be placed in various locations if people are willing to do that and if they request it. I had actually had one put in my yard twice for a period of a month each in order to gather some information from where I live in Castle Pines Village. We do have some recommendations into the FAA relative to the traffic pattern. I personally have met with the FAA and the tower manager at Centennial, and we've made some recommendations. And there is some validity to 1 or 2 of the things that we've suggested. But one of them, which would be a bit more of a dramatic change, would require an environmental study, and that, of course, would take years. The land use matters we review every single month. We resist some of the things that are proposed. Occasionally, we're successful in stopping a development. However, there are other times where we just simply get overridden by the counties, whether it be Arapahoe or Douglas. And as for the airport influence area and documents that are supposed to be signed at closing, that theoretically is done, at least on a first buyer of a new home. It's somewhere in the stack of documents that they sign at a closing. We assume that that's being done with some degree of regularity, but we have no guarantee. And as for windows and insulation and the like, sometimes that can have a mitigating factor if the people are inside. But where we get a lot of our complaints is when people are trying to entertain in the summer outside and grilling and sitting on a patio. And that's where we get a lot of our complaints about overflights. So it's something, and as for the state exerting pressure, many of our good neighbors have attempted to get an influence on us by the elected officials, both federal and state. And we have tried to do everything we possibly can relative to unleaded fuel. And we have gone to great lengths and great expense to convert over to unleaded fuel at Centennial. But we've also tried to address the noise complaints. And so anyway, I just thought I'd throw those in for what it's worth.
No, I appreciate it, Mr. Huffman. In case you don't know, Mr. Huffman is one of the board members on the Arapahoe County Public Airport Authority. And when I go to those meetings, I see him. I recognized your voice, and I'm like, I recognize the voice, and I looked it up, and I saw your picture. But thank you for watching tonight, and thank you for your input. We appreciate it.
Well, I tried to do the video, but it said you've disabled me, so I have officially been disabled.
Well,
I
I might get a license plate out of that.
Here, I can re-enable it. You were the angle you were at was odd, so I just muted it. There, you can.
Mr. Reindel,
Yes,
can you hear me?
yes.
Good evening. My name is Brad Walker. It's nice to talk to you outside of the Community Noise Roundtable. And I appreciate you taking your time being here. And I also appreciate CPA, Colorado Pilot Association, for putting this together and hosting it tonight. So thank you to both. I have a question. Part 150. I've been told it's not one and done. It is once we start, we're committed for the duration, whatever that means. Can you talk about that a little bit?
I can. So the intention of Part 150 is to um, determine land use compatibility or incompatible land uses, and then work to address those incompatible land uses. So it is intended that until you fully have addressed all incompatible land uses around an airport, that you would continue with Part 150. If you update your noise exposure map and you show that you have no incompatible land uses, that all the measures that you had recommended previously were successful, you no longer have incompatible land uses, there is nothing telling you to continue in the Part 150 program because you've done what Part 150 was set out to do. On the other hand of that, if airports don't need federal funding to do whatever it is they want to do, there's nothing compelling them to continue using Part 150, right? It's really meant to be a funding mechanism for airports to get funding for their noise mitigation, noise abatement measures. And if that isn't any longer needed, airports aren't compelled to continue doing Part 150 updates. It's quite, as you see, it's a 2-year process or more, quite expensive process. And the airports that either have completed their, they no longer have incompatible land uses, or they don't request federal funding any longer, they have stopped updating their Part 150s. Does that answer your question?
Oh yeah, absolutely, and I appreciate that.
Sure.
The yeah, I'm grateful for that. As part of the Part 150, will can you kind of describe how you cite the noise monitoring equipment?
That is done as a Part 150 measure, not done directly with the Part 150 study that we're doing now.
Oh,
It's because usually one of the, like what was in the 2008 NCP for Centennial was to acquire a noise and operations monitoring system, also known as NOMS. And in that process, and HMMH was involved with that process at the time to actually go out and determine areas for the noise monitors and determine what kind of data they were going to get in their system and all that. And so that's a different process than what's being done now. But there are processes in place as to how you identify locations for monitors. One is that you want to be able to determine whether there have been changes to the 65 DNL contour. So you want some that are pretty close to that contour, and then you can just watch the levels over time. And if over a couple of years they've gone up, you might say, well, it's time to do another 150 noise exposure map update or something like that. So, but then other places you tend to put them are in communities in which there are a lot of noise complaints and a lot of noise concerns about aircraft noise, to evaluate and again kind of see the trends with those monitors. So those are the reasons for monitoring and how you kind of decide where to put them.
interesting. Well, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Gene,
Mike,
go ahead. Oh,
Don, did you have a question?
Looks like he froze up.
yeah, Mr. Huffman froze up. Yeah, I have a question for you, Gene. Military aircraft. How much does that skew the data in any way?
Well, don't think of it as skewing the data. So back in the 1980s and 90s, we actually weren't allowed to include based military aircraft into the model. If it was transient, they were coming down, landing like Centennial has, you would have still included them. So they don't happen that regularly at Centennial. So when you look at an annual average day, which is what we're going to look at, there's a couple military operations, and so they are included. Every operation that could occur over the year is modeled and is included into the determination of the noise exposure.
Yeah, and I might, if I might jump in there, my internet went out there for a moment, so I missed part of that. But we do get F/A-18s with some degree of regularity, both Navy and Marine. They come in and do fueling at jet centers, but who has a contract. But I was asking a bit about the projected capacity. As you probably know, Gene, last year, Centennial was the #1 GA airport in the country with 362,407 operations. And I know that our neighbors are a little concerned about where this is going to go. And is it going to get, are we going to have more airplanes, which is of concern to them. And so I don't know how you're dealing with that in your study.
Well, as I pointed out in my presentation, there are two time periods that we do noise exposure maps and noise exposure contours for. The first is the existing condition. And so what it is like today, because the airport has to certify that the noise exposure map for the existing conditions does adequately represent current conditions. Okay. And then you also look at a 5-year forecast, 5 years beyond that existing condition. And for that, we rely heavily on the FAA's terminal area forecast. And they are projecting growth at Centennial over the next 5 years. And so we will be putting in additional operations over what's occurred currently, or what's occurring currently.
Has there been any discussion about the projected, well, it's not projected, it's proposed expansion of the Class B, which may encroach slightly on Centennial Airport, and that could have some effect on our operations?
You mean the DIA, Denver
Yes,
International
Denver,
Class B?
yeah.
Correct.
Yeah.
Yeah, and we'll want to keep a watch on that, see where that's headed, because it could have an effect on operations. When they do that, though, they would probably, the FAA would also have to determine any redesign of procedures, and that's what we'll follow more closely is, do they have to change any of the arrival or departure procedures in and out of Centennial as a result of that? And so one of the reasons we need the FAA and plan, including them in this project. So.
Yeah, they've already made some changes about arriving aircraft going to Rocky Mountain Regional from the east or the southeast. And that has also impacted our traffic pattern at Centennial, but not significantly. But they have made some changes to try to get them through the corridor over to the west side, rather than using a standard arrival route to one of the stars. So anyway, thank you, Mike and Gene. I appreciate it.
Of course.
No, you're most welcome. Is that the Metroplex, what I read today, the Metroplex project?
No, the Metroplex was separate from that. Then that's something that we actually went to court in Washington, D.C. to block, or at a minimum make changes. And we did make a couple of changes to it. And one of which was the Bronco arrival. And that now has been altered. It is not assigned anymore. It has to be requested by the FAA. And they will ask you to do that if you wish. But anyway, we did not succeed in blocking that. So Metroplex was implemented, but we have made some tweaks to it with our efforts, concerning the FAA and working and meeting with them. And some of the arrival routes has some unrealistic descent requirements from one fix to another, etc. And we do that typically in our Colorado or not our corporate pilots meeting, which is the second Tuesday of every month.
Okay. Good.
I don't know. Did I answer your question? I kind of got going there. Did I answer the question?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Good.
No, that's good. Any other questions for Gene on the Part 150 study? All right, we had a good turnout tonight. We had 33 people on board. That was good. Gene, again, thank you very much. I really appreciate it. And I'll be seeing you at the meetings, and with the noise roundtable and the commissioners whenever you give a presentation out there. That'd be fun.
Yeah, well, thank you. I thought this was a great idea. One of the first I've experienced in a Part 150 was for the pilots to reach out and invite me to let them know what's going on. It's exactly what should be happening at this stage in the Part 150. So I'll let Centennial know that this was a great success, and we probably want to come, later in the process and come let you know what we are thinking in terms of recommendations or things like that. I think it'd be
Yeah,
good to keep you involved.
Yeah, thank you. I got to give credit to Brian Garrett, our webmaster. It was his idea. He sent me an email one day and said, "Hey, Mike, what about getting somebody?" And I said, "I think I know somebody."
Yeah.
All right. Well, I'm
Yeah.
happy to do it. So
Thank
this
you.
is, one of the things I really strive to do is educate and inform, right? And that's what a lot of dealing with aircraft noise over the last 35 years has trained me to do, and I really like doing it. So,
Okay, great.
all
Thank
right.
you, everyone. Thank you.